Well, it occurred to me that today is 10 years since I was expelled. Like, May 13th is 10 years since I was expelled from the United Arab Emirates. I was taken to the airport in chains, and I had 5 minutes to see my family. And then it was living in an airport for the next month because I had literally nowhere to go. And it just happened that I got stuck in Malaysia. I spent a day stuck in Abu Dhabi, and then I was stuck in Kuala Lumpur airport for a month. And it just happened that it was Nakba Day, 2014. Until that moment, the Nakba was, in my conception, or at least in my consciousness and my psyche, it was an event. The idea of the Nakba as something ongoing or a structure rather than an event was not something that I understood instinctively. Of course, that moment just showed me. I mean, I was in an airport with everything I have was basically a little suitcase that I was allowed to carry with me because it's a sudden expulsion. And I remembered, what rung in my head was these two little verse from a longer poem by Mahmoud Darwish. يا جرحي المكابر وطني ليس حقيبة. My home is not a suitcase. And I looked, and all I could see is that suitcase, and I was in the middle of the unknown. I had no idea where I'm going to end up. I have no idea what's going to happen to me. It was just a sense of complete, not just helplessness, but also confusion. Like the future seems completely blocked. I said earlier that the Nakba can be thought of as a structure and not just an event. And this actually comes from, I think, a Palestinian human rights lawyer who kind of tried to define the Nakba basically as a structure, as an organizing structure of Palestinian life. I'm reading here from an article on the Nation. Track form: the Nakba is a structure that serves to erase the group dynamic, the attempt to incapacitate the Palestinians from exercising their political will as a group. It is the continuous collusion of states and systems to exclude the Palestinians from materializing their rights to self determination. In its most material form, the Nakba is each Palestinian killed or injured, each Palestinian imprisoned or otherwise subjugated, and each Palestinian dispossessed or exiled. The human rights lawyer here is Rabia Ighbariya. The definition itself here, like I said, was not something that I could understand at an emotional, experiential level until that moment. And of course, at that moment, I hadn't really read that definition. But it's the sense that when we say that the Nakba is an ongoing event, it was the idea that no matter where you are, no matter how much you accomplish in life, if you are Palestinian, this is something that can happen to you. You can never, ever feel safe in feeling like you have home, you have stability, you have community, or you have human rights. Everything that you build can be taken away from you immediately. And you're helpless. And there's this sense of confusion, incapacitation, helplessness, and a blocked horizon where you don't know what's next. So this is it's we talk about 1948, but if we actually apply this definition, it would be something that actually probably precedes 1948. This denial of collective rights, but also the denial of our very existence as a people. I'm still kind of coping with the death of my father, who died earlier in March, about 6 weeks ago. A few scenes in my head. The first is when, that time in the airport when I had to say goodbye to my family, he wasn't there. And I was kind of surprised that he wasn't there. And that's when they told me that he's not well. My father started to exhibit symptoms of dementia after my arrest. And part of me did not understand just how bad it was on that day itself. I'm going to fast forward a lot to 2023, last year, when I managed to see my family for the first time in many years. My father's condition had deteriorated a lot. He, of course, before my arrest, he was a cardiologist working in the United Arab Emirates. And I remember climbing, like they live in this kind of narrow house in Canada now, and he had his own room on the second story. And I remember climbing this narrow staircase and then looking and seeing him in the room to the side, and he wasn't fully awake. He was kind of asleep, leaning to the side, drooling a little bit. And I walked up, stood in the room, and I could feel so much heaviness. I could feel like I'm standing. How can a shadow feel so heavy? Because it feels like I'm standing in the shadow of something very big, and it's whatever it is so heavy that even its shadow feels heavy. And immediately, the first thing that came to my mind is that I'm standing in the shadow of the Nakba. And again, almost instinctively, the next thought in my head is like, I'm also standing in the shadow of the Holocaust. A little bit before, I was told that my father was not feeling well, that he was sick, and that it's become critical and I should go to Canada to see him before it's too late. I actually, from the beginning of the current genocide in Gaza, it was difficult for me to speak to my family, especially my mom. We didn't know how to speak about Gaza. We didn't really know how to speak. I mean, we're all in immense pain over what's happening, especially that it's opens up. It kind of explodes all of our intergenerational traumas, because this is something we've seen repeatedly, generation after generation, and we didn't know. I mean, we would speak, we would text, and we wouldn't be able to really get in. Like we're almost not speaking about. It's almost like the elephant in the room in every conversation. We don't speak about it. At some point, we managed to actually sit down, me and my mom, and Fadwa was there, and maybe having her there made it easier for us to actually have the conversation. And then my mom started speaking, and she it was heartbreaking, but it was also kind of cathartic. And she talked about the news of the day, about Gaza, about what was happening at the time, but she also mentioned our initial expulsion from Palestine, and how my father at the time was a toddler. He was 4 months old. She told me about how scared they were in the boat. They left from Jaffa on boats. She mentioned how my grandmother would hold up, she would carry him up on her shoulder, above her shoulder, because there's so much seawater coming into the boat, and she wanted to protect him from the water splashing on his face. She mentioned how, eventually they would actually end up in Gaza, and then they would be reunited, like, because the men and the women kind of separated from each other, and they were reunited when they crossed over into Egypt. Throughout all of this, she's crying, and it felt like she looked so, because he's in the room, and she would look over, and it felt like the Nakba lived with her in the room. It felt like my father was a visual representation of the Nakba. Final thing I'll mention is when he passed, and right after his passing, it was right before Fajr. This was in Ramadan, last 10 days of Ramadan, and our immediate reaction, of course, was to text family. There's so much community destruction that comes with the Nakba, the destruction of Palestinian families, the separation of Palestinian families. I mean, until it's curious, because I started the story talking about the airport, and for as long as I remember, even before I got stuck in the airport was not a nice place for me, because even as a kid, I was afraid of airports. I mean, I was only maybe 4 years old when the first time I experienced tension in an airport, and that was when I was trying to cross the border with my mom. My mom has a Jordanian passport; she's Palestinian with a Jordanian passport, and until my expulsion, I had a refugee's travel document. Actually, until last summer, I was always a stateless refugee, legally speaking. So my first exposure into this tension, the idea that airports are not nice places, is when I was 4 years old, and I was separated from my mom, because my mom went and stood in the citizens line, because she's a citizen, and she had two young boys with her, myself and my brother, who was, again, he was a toddler at the time. And then she was asked to go back and stand in the line with the refugees, even though she's a citizen. Because why? Because she has two refugee kids with her, and she cannot even pass citizenship to them. And of course, you don't remember the incident when you're a kid, but you remember the emotions, especially the emotions of your parents. And all I remember is just how upset my mom was. And later on, I would know exactly what happened, because the passport control officer said something like, "It's your fault. Why did you marry a Palestinian? Like, why would you do this to your kids? Marry a Palestinian and have them, be born refugees." What's especially painful is probably the passport control officer has Palestinian roots himself. I mean, a lot of people in Jordan are, but also airports were associated in my imagination or my psyche with people falling apart, people feeling like people hugging their family for the first time in years, people saying goodbye to their family without knowing when they can even meet them. Airports were kind of like this always closed door to freedom, but also sometimes a prison. So anyway, back to my father's passing and us kind of trying to communicate and text relatives and let them know that this has happened, and then realizing that he hasn't seen this brother for 15 years, he hasn't seen this other brother for 10 years, he hasn't seen this other brother or sister for such a long time. And the idea that we have so much family around the world that we don't know. I mean, the last time I was able to meet some of them, sometimes when I was like 17, I'm 40, turning 47 next month. When I was 17, some others when I was 12. This idea that you're not even allowed, like you can't form family in one place without that being shattered at some point. Separation from your loved ones. You can't even assume that you can see them whenever you want. And the fact that eventually when he was buried so far away from anything that he would consider home. This was in a tiny Canadian town, somewhere in New Brunswick. We have no community there. Nobody knows us. He doesn't know anybody. My father was a cardiologist who saved lives for all of his career. He was a doctor. Nobody who was touched by him, nobody who was treated by him could be there. It was only me and my brother having to carry all of that. So yeah, this is the Nakba for us. I told you my experience as someone who's a refugee, who's a lifelong refugee, whose experience of the Nakba is this: it's communal destruction, expulsion, separation from family, inability to form roots, constantly trying to find home. There are other Palestinians you might speak to, and their experience would be different. I'm sure that people living in Gaza, their experience is different. People living, Palestinian citizens of Israel, their experience would be different. People in the West Bank would be different. Refugees who are in Lebanon or in Jordan or elsewhere, their experiences will be different. And some experiences might be contradictory. But this is what the Nakba means to me. It's interesting that earlier in the conversation I mentioned the shadow of the Holocaust. And it's kind of painful, but also profound and important to mention that, in a way, the people who would understand the most what I just expressed, with all of its pain and also all of its pride, because the pride is important. The pride is realizing that despite all of this, we have survived. Sometimes we have even thrived. Sometimes we've made names for ourselves, we've built careers for ourselves, we've produced so much beauty, we've produced so much love. We build institutions, we have built, created knowledge, and we are still, and sometimes even more strongly, Palestinian. This resilience, which I'm ambivalent about, like sometimes you say like you're not supposed to be resilient because you're not, these things are not supposed to happen to you. But at the same time, it is a thing of pride. When you survive, you say, yeah, I survived and I'm strong. I mean, it's not contradictory to say that no, these things should not happen to anyone. Nobody should be forced to be resilient, but also I should be proud of my resilience, or I deserve to be proud of my resilience. But anyway, I digress. I think a people who would understand what it means, what the Nakba means, more than most, would be Jewish people. This experience of communal destruction, of erasure, of not being able to build roots, of not being able to find home, I think this is also the Jewish experience for much of history. Maybe not all Jewish people, and certainly not today's Israeli Jews, who have not. The majority of Israeli Jews have not experienced this. Of course, their parents, grandparents, etc., might have experienced it, but as for them themselves, this is not something that they have personal. I think the majority of them would not have personal, direct experience of it. But it pains me. It pains me because you could see that the people who were the direct, proximate cause of our Nakba fully understood what it feels like to be subjected to a Nakba. It just seems that genocide is just the next step. I don't know. Maybe genocide and Nakba are, in a way, intersecting terms, intersecting structures.